welcome back to another installment of our Introduction to Biblical Hebrew. We are continuing our introductory talks about what we're actually doing in class. We talked about what is a language last time, and this time we'll talk about the question, what is Hebrew? Now, it might seem like that's a really simple question to answer. What's Hebrew? It's a language. It's the language of the Old Testament. It's the language of modern Israel. It's the language of Jewish people throughout history. Already we've got some pretty complicated things from different time periods and places and different contexts. But if you think about this question, what is any language? What is English, right? I mean, it might seem straightforward. It's what's in the dictionary or something, but which dictionary? And by the way, there's lots of different kinds of English spoken around the world today. English from England is different from English in the United States, but also within the United States, there's many different kinds of English spoken. There is English spoken as a first language in many countries throughout the world, and there's English as a second or continuing language in many places around the world. So the English that you'll find in Hyderabad, India, is not the same kind of English that you'll find in Atlanta, Georgia. But in Atlanta, Georgia, you might be able to find all kinds of different English dialects spoken, including the kind of English spoken in Hyderabad, India. So all to say, it's really what is English? Oh my goodness, it's a network of different sub-languages, really. And with Hebrew, it's kind of the same thing. The kind of Hebrew that we're going to be studying is a literary Hebrew. It's a Hebrew it's a version of the Hebrew language used to write down literature and liturgy and things like this. It's a particular kind of Hebrew. It's also ancient. It's not modern Hebrew. So we're not going to be studying like how to go to a Jewish restaurant in Jerusalem and order dinner. Sorry, we're not going to do it because no one in the Bible's doing that kind of thing, right? They didn't have like takeout in the ancient world. But also, we're not going to learn things like, I'm not going to spend a lot of time teaching you how to say hi and bye, because they didn't actually say those kinds of things in ancient times, or even thank you, or I'm sorry. Those are words that aren't really in the ancient vocabulary very much because they had a very different way of relating to one another. So all to say, we're going to be learning the ancient literary language of ancient biblical Hebrew. Which is kind of a world unto itself. It will help you if you want to learn modern Israeli spoken Hebrew. It's not bad for that, but if you just learn what you learn in this class and then go to Israel and try to use it, people are going to say, you talk like the Bible, which is literally what someone said to one of my professors when he got on the bus, asked where something was, and the guy said, you talk like the Bible in modern Hebrew. So we're learning the Hebrew language that was spoken and written, more written than spoken actually. We're learning the literary language, but we're learning that language that existed sometime between the years 1000 about BC and somewhere around the year 300 BC. That's what we're learning in that window of time. So there's actually 700 years in there, which is a long period of time, and there's lots of change in that too. So we're even going to have some discussions near the end of the semester about how to tell very early things from very late things, which there's a big argument about. As you might imagine with everything in the academic world, there's some kind of an argument. But if we're going to classify Hebrew, what kind of language is Hebrew? Languages don't ever exist in a vacuum. They all emerged from one another throughout time. And Hebrew is from a family of languages called Semitic languages. Just like French is part of a language family called the Romance languages, right? So Hebrew is a Semitic language, which is associated with the area that we might call today, using kind of modern geographic terms, the Middle East and North and East Africa. So these are some general regions that we're talking about. Other Semitic languages include the languages of ancient Mesopotamia, which is what's in modern day is called Iraq. But this is like the Assyrians and the Babylonians and so on. They spoke a Semitic language that was related to Hebrew. That was East Semitic. So Akkadian is the word that you'll use if you want to learn that kind of thing, which there's lots of things written in ancient Akkadian, like some ancient creation stories that we'll talk about in Old Testament class. You can read Gilgamesh and things like that. There's a lot of amazing early literature written in these languages. Sumerian is kind of a different type of language. It's actually not related to any other known living language. Isn't that interesting? But it was one of the first written languages, Sumerian. You can see it on the map here. Kind of southeastern Iraq, right where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers meet, what's now the Persian Gulf. That was ancient Sumer. So the Sumerians invented the kind of writing that people used in that region, but their language was not related to Semitic people's languages. So Hammurabi of Babylon is Semitic and a Semitic speaker. He's not a Sumerian. And everyone after him who lives in that area. So in any event, but all to say, the peoples who live in North Arabia, the Arabic is a Semitic language. It's modern Arabic is derivative of languages that were spoken at the time of the Bible. There are Arab people in the Bible who speak Arab languages in the Bible, in the Old Testament. So that is to say, they were traders generally. The way that they interacted with peoples who lived in the area around what's now Israel. That is the Arab and Hebrew Jewish people have been interacting in that region for many thousands of years. So in any event, we will come across some mentions of Arabic in the Bible, but it was a related language. And so if you learn Hebrew, it's a lot easier to learn Arabic than it would be if you kind of just jump straight into Arabic. They're related kind of like French and Spanish are. And then we have South Semitic languages, including down here, Ethiopic and South Arabian. Ethiopic is the language of ancient Ethiopia, and it is a Semitic language. It's related to Hebrew. So if you learn Hebrew, it's possible to imagine learning an ancient Ethiopian language like Ethiopic, Ge'ez, and so on. Egyptian is part of the Hamitic language family, and Cushitic, the language of the Cushites, kind of modern-day Sudan. These are somewhat different language families, but they're somewhat related. There are some loan words and things too. But so, all to say, when we talk about Canaanite, Aramaic, and Hebrew, we're talking about Northwest Semitic languages. So Aramaic and Hebrew are pretty close. There's some differences, but they're pretty close. And Canaanite is Hebrew. Sorry. They're basically the same language. We can read ancient Moabite. It's basically the same language as ancient Hebrew. So if you learn Hebrew, you can read Moabite. There's not a whole lot of it out there. There's one big stone, but you can read the Moabite stone if you know Hebrew, ancient Hebrew. You can also read the language of Ugarit, which is a city in ancient Canaan, which has the Baal cycle, like the hymns and the songs sung to Baal, the god Baal. You can read that stuff if you know Hebrew. So all to say, Hebrew is closely related to the languages of their neighbors, the languages of Canaan, and also the language Aramaic. So in any event, it's within that language family. These are some of the oldest languages, oldest written languages that we know about. We can get into that more in Old Testament class. But there are about 70 different known Semitic languages. So there's a lot of them. You can see this kind of, they grew out. There's Proto-Semitic. I'll refer to this a few times. That's like named down here at the bottom. It's, think about languages being related to each other like a family tree. Earlier languages kind of morph into later languages. So Proto-Semitic is the earliest Semitic language, and we don't have any record of it. It's a made-up language. It's made up because we think it had to be there. Kind of like sometimes you're like, well, if you see these two different types of birds that evolved in the same place, and you can tell they're related, but they must have been some lost ancestor. Well, that's what they're guessing at here. There's a lost kind of ancient Semitic language that was the first one that was never written down, so we don't know what it is. But we have the East Semitic branches like Akkadian, that's the Babylonian folks. I'm following on this little map over here of this little tree here. So Akkadian, that's the language of Assyria and Babylonia. And then also Eblaite, which is a language of folks who live near Assyria and Babylonia, and who were power players for a while in the ancient Near East, but never quite made it all the way to conquering the coast where Israel was, or near the coast. Then we can see that there's Arabic is another family tree, Arabic and Maltese, Ethiopic, which has Ge'ez, Amharic, and Tigrinya, and then South Arabian languages, which I'm sure some of them are still spoken in some ways today, but Arabic has really won out in the area that you would call it the UAE and so on. So in any event, Arabic has kind of taken over as a global language for that region. But you can also see Northwest Semitic languages here. So Arabic, East Semitic, and Northwest Semitic are our three major branches for people who were living in what's Southwest Asia, and then of course Ethiopic and South Arabian crossing the Red Sea. So Northwest Semitic languages here, we've got Ugaritic, that's basically Canaanite. I know it says Canaanite over here, they're like a little bit north of the Canaanites, but they basically spoke Canaanite. You got Edomite, Ammonite, Moabite, Phoenician, and then Punic, people who lived in like Carthage, they were Phoenicians, and they lived they were seafaring peoples, so they had colonies spread around the Mediterranean. But anyway, so the Phoenicians, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, they all basically speak and write in exactly the same language as Hebrew. It's very close. There are very few differences. And then Aramaic is a slightly different language that's part of the Northwest Semitic language family. All to say, this is what we're studying, this little language of a people who were immersed in a sea of people who spoke many other much more powerful languages. If you look over here, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they wrote Akkadian was like the global language that people wrote and spoke in this part of the world. But something crazy happened with all these little languages: Edomite, Ammonite, Moabite, Hebrew, Phoenician, Ugaritic, and Aramaic. All of them were some of the first vernacular languages ever written. That is to say, the Akkadian that was written before Hebrew. The Assyrian and Babylonian, even the Sumerian stuff, that was like a language of empire. The first local languages that we know of that were actually written in alphabetic scripts, so they were written like A, B, C, that kind of thing. That was a lot easier to learn than cuneiform, which had like syllables and things. It was very difficult to learn. So the first alphabetic languages written to record local speech that people actually kind of spoke in. These were these Northwest Semitic languages that all started to be written down about the same time, right around the year 1200 BC. This is an amazing thing. We also have, in Hebrew, one of these little languages out here. We have the first ever recorded direct speech from a god to a people. So all these other languages record lots of different times that God spoke to high kings and high priests and so on, but only in Hebrew do you have a God addressing a people without a priest standing in the way, or without a king, without some sort of nobility or something. And this is what we see in Exodus 19 when God starts to speak to the people. In Exodus 20, when God says, "You shall have no other gods before me." God means the people. God's speaking to the people. So all to say that Hebrew looks like a little language within this big map of Semitic languages, but it's part of something really amazing, a revolution in thought that I think is not incidentally related to the fact that we claim that this is sacred scripture. So in any event, why Hebrew? Well, my goodness. We study Hebrew in part because it gives us access to this amazing place and time and this way of seeing the world into which God spoke these words. And I'll end with this. This 3,000-year-old language that you're about to learn, that was one of the first local languages ever written down, the first language in which anyone ever claimed that God spoke to a people and treated them as equals. That was this language that we hear from right now. It's been re-energized in the 19th and 20th century. It was resurrected. It was a liturgical language that Jews have used throughout history, but Jews ended up using different languages, Aramaic, for example, but Greek, and then the many languages of Europe, Yiddish, which is a combination of Hebrew and German, but really, it's German of a particular place and time and so on. So all to say, Jews ended up speaking languages all over the world, but used Hebrew only really to read the Bible and to pray in church. It was a little bit like Latin, in Roman Catholic churches. It's kind of a dead language that was used liturgically. But in the 19th century, there were Jews that revived the use of spoken and written Hebrew, and that's what you would see if you went to modern Israel. You would encounter people who speak Hebrew as a living language. Of course, in order to do that, they had to change the language because you can't just resurrect a 3,000-year-old language and use it in the 19th century or the 20th century, right? I mean, that doesn't make sense. So you have to have words like, university. So they just took those words, from English. But they've changed some things, like they changed the writing system a bit and so on. We're going to learn ancient Hebrew. That's what we're going to focus on. After you learn ancient Hebrew, learning modern Hebrew is a breeze. But I'm not going to make you do that or quiz you on it. You'll notice in chapter 1 of the textbook, the authors tell you how to write in modern cursive Israeli Hebrew. I'm not going to ask you to ever memorize that. The ancient stuff, what you see up above here, those kinds of letters, it's really Aramaic square script, which Hebrew folks borrowed. We'll get to that later. But that's what I'm going to kind of quiz you on knowing, is this script. So, all that in mind, this tongue of holiness, that's what the ancient Jews called Hebrew, like the tongue that God, the speech that God uses, right? They believe that God actually spoke Hebrew to create the world. I don't know if I buy that, but well, language did God speak, right? So the Jews might have they might have something on us there. So, in any event, the language that was spoken by all of the matriarchs and patriarchs in the history of Israel, that language that Moses spoke in, that language of the Old Testament, and of much Jewish literature since, which is full of beauty and joy and deep spirituality. That's what you're learning when you learn this, the language that Jesus actually knew and actually spoke. I know that Jesus spoke Aramaic, right? But Jesus didn't just speak Aramaic. He spoke a mixture of Aramaic and Hebrew. Every time we hear Jesus speak in the New Testament, like when he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is a quotation from Psalm 22. Eloi, Eloi, that's good Hebrew. That means my God, my God. That's not Aramaic. And then lama, that's good Hebrew too. That means why. But then sabachthani, that's just Aramaic. That's not Hebrew. So in any event, Jesus spoke a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic, which we would expect. Aramaic was a language of an empire that was imposed on the people, so they mixed it up with their own language, and it became their own. So all to say, the language that Jesus spoke to, or at least in part, that's what we are learning to speak when we speak and read in ancient Hebrew. So, here's to a new creation. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim va'et haaretz. All right, we have one more sort of introductory lesson, and then I'll be on the alphabet itself. So join me to learn about what is the alphabet, or is it an alphabet?